Book 4, Section 55, Part 3, of The World as Will and Idea, Volume 1, by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by R.B. Haldane and J. Kemp, this LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Book 4, The World as Will, Second Aspect, the assertion and denial of the will to live when self-consciousness has been attained. Section 55, Part 3. As a result of the whole of this discussion of the freedom of the will and what relates to it, we find that although the will may, in itself and apart from the phenomenon, be called free and even omnipotent, yet in its particular phenomena, enlightened by knowledge, as in men and brutes, it is determined by motives to which the special character regularly and necessarily responds, and always in the same way. We see that because of the possession on his part of abstract or rational knowledge, man, as distinguished from the brutes, has a choice, which only makes him the scene of the conflict of his motives without withdrawing him from their control. This choice is therefore certainly the condition of the possibility of the complete expression of the individual character, but is by no means to be regarded as freedom of the particular volition, that is, independence of the law of causality, the necessity of which extends to man as to every other phenomenon. Thus, the difference between human volition and that of the brutes, which is introduced by reason or knowledge through concepts, extends to the point we have indicated and no farther. But what is quite a different thing, there may arise a phenomenon of the human will which is quite impossible in the brute creation if man altogether lays aside the knowledge of particular things as such, which is subordinate to the principle of sufficient reason, and by means of his knowledge of the ideas sees through the principium individuationis. Then an actual appearance of the real freedom of the will as a thing in itself is possible, by which the phenomenon comes into a sort of contradiction with itself, as is indicated by the word self-renunciation, and finally the in itself of its nature suppresses itself. But this, the one real and direct expression of the freedom of the will in itself in the phenomenon, cannot be distinctly explained here, but will form the subject of the concluding part of our work. Now that we have shown clearly in these pages the unalterable nature of the empirical character, which is just the unfolding of the intelligible character that lies outside time, together with the necessity with which actions follow upon its contact with motives, we hasten to anticipate an argument which may very easily be drawn from this in the interest of bad dispositions. Our character is to be regarded as the temporal unfolding of an extra-temporal and therefore indivisible and unalterable act of will, or an intelligible character. This necessarily determines all that is essential in our conduct in life, that is, its ethical content, which must express itself in accordance with it in its phenomenal appearance, the empirical character, while only what is unessential in this, the outward form of our course of life, depends upon the forms in which the motives present themselves. It might therefore be inferred that it is a waste of trouble to endeavour to improve one's character, and that it is wiser to submit to the inevitable and gratify every inclination at once, even if it is bad. But this is precisely the same thing as the theory of an inevitable fate, which is called Argos Logos, and in more recent times Turkish faith. Its true refutation, as it is supposed to have been given by Chrysippus, is explained by Cicero in his book De Fato. Though everything may be regarded as irrevocably predetermined by fate, yet it is so only through the medium of the chain of causes. Therefore in no case can it be determined that an effect shall appear without its cause. Thus it is not simply the event that is predetermined, but the event as the consequence of preceding causes, so that fate does not decide the consequence alone, but also the means as the consequence of which it is destined to appear. Accordingly, if some means is not present, it is certain that the consequence also will not be present. Each is always present in accordance with the determination of fate, but this is never known to us till afterwards. As events always take place according to fate, that is, according to the infinite concatenation of causes, so our actions always take place according to our intelligible character. But just as we do not know the former beforehand, so no a priori insight is given us into the latter, but we only come to know ourselves as we come to know other persons a posteriori through experience. If the intelligible character involved that we could only form a good resolution after a long conflict with a bad disposition, this conflict would have to come first and be waited for. Reflection on the unalterable nature of the character, on the unity of the source from which all our actions flow, must not mislead us into claiming the decision of the character in favour of one side or the other. It is in the resolve that follows that we shall see what manner of men we are, and mirror ourselves in our actions. This is the explanation of the satisfaction or the anguish of soul with which we look back on the course of our past life. Both are experienced not because these past deeds have still an existence, they are past, they have been and now are no more. But their great importance for us lies in their significance, lies in the fact that these deeds are the expression of the character, the mirror of the will, in which we look and recognize our inmost self, the kernel of our will. Because we experience this not before, but only after, it behooves us to strive and fight in time, in order that the picture we produce by our deeds may be such that the contemplation of it may calm us as much as possible, instead of harassing us. The significance of this consolation or anguish of soul will, as we have said, be inquired into farther on. But to this place there belongs the inquiry which follows and which stands by itself. Besides the intelligible and the empirical character, we must mention a third, which is different from them both, the acquired character, which one only receives in life through contact with the world, and which is referred to when one is praised as a man of character, or censured as being without character. Certainly one might suppose that since the empirical character, as the phenomenon of the intelligible, is unalterable, and, like every natural phenomenon, is consistent with itself, man would always have to appear like himself and consistent, and would therefore have no need to acquire a character artificially by experience and reflection. But the case is otherwise, and although a man is always the same, yet he does not always understand himself, but often mistakes himself till he has in some degree acquired real self-knowledge. The empirical character as a mere natural tendency is in itself irrational. Nay, more, its expressions are disturbed by reason, all the more so the more intellect and power of thought the man has. For these always keep before him what becomes man in general as the character of the species, and what is possible for him both in will and in deed. This makes it the more difficult for him to see how much his individuality enables him to will and to accomplish. He finds in himself the germs of all the various human pursuits and powers, but the difference of degree in which they exist in his individuality is not clear to him in the absence of experience, and if he now applies himself to the pursuits which alone correspond to his character, he yet feels, especially at particular moments and in particular moods, the inclination to directly opposite pursuits which cannot be combined with them, but must be entirely suppressed if he desires to follow the former undisturbed. For as our physical path upon earth is always merely a line, not an extended surface, so in life, if we desire to grasp and possess one thing, we must renounce and leave innumerable others on the right hand and on the left. If we cannot make up our minds to this, but, like children at the fair, snatch at everything that attracts us in passing, we are making the perverse endeavour to change the line of our path into an extended surface. We run in a zigzag, skip about like a will-o'-the-wisp, and attain to nothing. Or, to use another comparison, as, according to Hobbes's philosophy of law, every one has an original right to everything but an exclusive right to nothing, yet can obtain an exclusive right to particular things by renouncing his right to all the rest, while others on their part do likewise with regard to what he has chosen, so is it in life, in which some definite pursuit, whether it be pleasure, honor, wealth, science, art, or virtue, can only be followed with seriousness and success, when all claims that are foreign to it are given up, when everything else is renounced. Accordingly, the mere will and the mere ability are not sufficient, but a man must also know what he wills and know what he can do. Only then will he show character, and only then can he accomplish something right. Until he attains to that, notwithstanding the natural consistency of the empirical character, he is without character. And although, on the whole, he must remain true to himself and fulfill his course, led by his demon, yet his path will not be a straight line, but wavering and uneven. He will hesitate, deviate, turn back, lay up for himself repentance and pain. And all this is because in great and small he sees before him all that is possible and attainable for man in general, but does not know what part of all this is alone suitable for him, can be accomplished by him, and is alone enjoyable by him. He will therefore envy many men on account of a position and circumstances which are yet only suitable to their characters, and not to his, and in which he would feel unhappy if indeed he found them endurable at all. For as a fish is only at home in water, a bird in the air, a mole in the earth, so every man is only at home in the atmosphere suitable to him. For example, not all men can breathe the air of court life. From deficiency of proper insight into all this, many a man will make all kinds of abortive attempts, will do violence to his character in particulars, and yet, on the whole, will have to yield to it again, and what he thus painfully attains will give him no pleasure; what he thus learns will remain dead. Even in an ethical regard, a deed that is too noble for his character, that has not sprung from pure direct impulse, but from a concept, a dogma, will lose all merit even in his own eyes through subsequent egoistical repentance. Velle non discitur. We only become conscious of the inflexibility of another person's character through experience. Until then we childishly believe that it is possible, by means of rational ideas, by prayers and entreaties, by example and noble-mindedness, ever to persuade any one to leave his own way, to change his course of conduct, to depart from his mode of thinking, or even to extend his capacities. So is it also with ourselves. We must first learn from experience what we desire and what we can do. Till then we know it not, we are without character, and must often be driven back to our own way by hard blows from without. But if we have finally learnt it, then we have attained to what in the world is called character, the acquired character. This is accordingly nothing but the most perfect knowledge possible of our own individuality. It is the abstract and consequently distinct knowledge of the unalterable qualities of our own empirical character, and of the measure and direction of our mental and physical powers, and thus of the whole strength and weakness of our own individuality. This places us in a position to carry out deliberately and methodically the rôle which belongs to our own person, and to fill up the gaps which caprices or weaknesses produce in it, under the guidance of fixed conceptions. This rôle is in itself unchangeably determined once for all, but hitherto we have allowed it to follow its natural course without any rule. We have now brought to distinct conscious maxims, which are always present to us, the form of conduct which is necessarily determined by our own individual nature. And now we conduct it in accordance with them as deliberately as if we had learned it, without ever falling into error through the passing influence of the mood or the impression of the present, without being checked by the bitterness or sweetness of some particular thing we meet with on our path, without delay, without hesitation, without inconsistency. We shall now no longer, as novices, wait, attempt, and grope about in order to see what we really desire and are able to do. But we know this once for all, and in every choice we have only to apply general principles to particular cases, and arrive at once at a decision. We know our will in general, and do not allow ourselves to be led by the passing mood, or by solicitations from without, to resolve in particular cases what is contrary to it as a whole. We know in the same way the nature and the measure of our strength and our weakness, and thereby are spared much suffering. For we experience no real pleasure except in the use and feeling of our own powers, and the greatest pain is the conscious deficiency of our powers where we need them. If now we have discovered where our strength and our weakness lie, we will endeavour to cultivate, employ, and in every way make use of those talents which are naturally prominent in us. We will always turn to those occupations in which they are valuable and to the purpose, and entirely avoid, even with self-renunciation, those pursuits for which we have naturally little aptitude. We will beware of attempting that in which we have no chance of succeeding. Only he who has attained to this will constantly and with full consciousness be completely himself, and will never fail himself at the critical moment, because he will always have known what he could expect from himself. He will often enjoy the satisfaction of feeling his strength, and seldom experience the pain of being reminded of his weakness. The latter is mortification, which causes perhaps the greatest of mental sufferings. Therefore it is far more endurable to have our misfortune brought clearly before us than our incapacity. And further, if we are thus fully acquainted with our strength and our weakness, we will not attempt to make a show of powers which we do not possess. We will not play with base coin, for all such dissimulation misses the mark in the end. For since the whole man is only the phenomenon of his will, nothing can be more perverse than to try, by means of reflection, to become something else than one is. For this is a direct contradiction of the will with itself. The imitation of the qualities and idiosyncrasies of others is much more shameful than to dress in other people's clothes, for it is the judgment of our own worthlessness pronounced by ourselves. Knowledge of our own mind and its capacities of every kind, and our unalterable limits, is in this respect the surest way to the attainment of the greatest possible contentment with ourselves. For it holds good of inward as of outward circumstances that there is for us no consolation so effective as the complete certainty of unalterable necessity. No evil that befalls us pains us so much as the thought of the circumstances by which it might have been warded off. Therefore nothing comforts us so effectually as the consideration of what has happened from the standpoint of necessity, from which all accidents appear as tools in the hand of an overruling fate, and we therefore recognize the evil that has come to us as inevitably produced by the conflict of inner and outer circumstances, in other words, fatalism. We really only complain and storm so long as we hope either to affect others or to excite ourselves to unheard of efforts. But children and grown-up people know very well to yield contentedly as soon as they clearly see that it absolutely cannot be otherwise. Animo in pectoribus nostro domito necessitate. We are like the entrapped elephants that rage and struggle for many days, till they see that it is useless, and then suddenly offer their necks quietly to the yoke, tamed forever. We are like King David, who as long as his son still lived, unceasingly importuned Jehovah with prayers, and behaved himself as if in despair, but as soon as his son was dead, thought no longer about it. Hence it arises that innumerable permanent ills, such as lameness, poverty, low estate, ugliness, a disagreeable dwelling place, are borne with indifference by innumerable persons, and are no longer felt like healed wounds, just because these persons know that inward or outward necessity renders it impossible that any change can take place in these things, while those who are more fortunate cannot understand how such misfortunes can be borne. Now as with outward necessity, so also with inward, nothing reconciles so thoroughly as a distinct knowledge of it. If we have once for all distinctly recognized not only our good qualities and our strength, but also our defects and weakness, establish our aim accordingly, and rest satisfied concerning what cannot be attained, we thus escape in the surest way, as far as our individuality permits, the bitterest of all sorrows, discontentment with ourselves, which is the inevitable result of ignorance of our own individuality, of false conceit, and the audacity that proceeds from it. To the bitter chapter of the self-knowledge here recommended, the lines of Ovid admit of excellent application. Optimus ille animi vindex laedentia pectus, vincula qui rupit, dedoluitque semo. So much with regard to the acquired character, which indeed is not of so much importance for ethics proper as for life in the world. But its investigation was related as that of a third species to the investigation of the intelligible and the empirical character, in regard to which we were obliged to enter upon a somewhat detailed inquiry in order to bring out clearly how in all its phenomena the will is subject to necessity, while yet in itself it may be called free and even omnipotent. End of Book 4, Section 55. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Book 4, Section 56, of The World as Will and Idea, Volume 1, by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by R.B. Haldane and J. Kemp. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Book 4, The World as Will, Second Aspect. The Assertion and Denial of the Will to Live, when Self-Consciousness has been attained. Section 56. This freedom, this omnipotence, as the expression of which the whole visible world exists and progressively develops in accordance with the laws which belong to the form of knowledge, can now, at the point at which in its most perfect manifestation it has attained to the completely adequate knowledge of its own nature, express itself anew in two ways. Either it wills here, at the summit of mental endowment and self-consciousness, simply what it willed before, blindly and unconsciously, and if so, knowledge always remains its motive in the whole as in the particular case. Or, conversely, this knowledge becomes it for a quieter, which appeases and suppresses all willing. This is that assertion and denial of the will to live, which was stated above in general terms. As, in the reference of individual conduct, a general, not a particular manifestation of will, it does not disturb and modify the development of the character, nor does it find its expression in particular actions, but, either by an ever more marked appearance of the whole method of action it has followed hitherto, or conversely by the entire suppression of it, it expresses in a living form the maxims which the will has freely adopted in accordance with the knowledge it has now attained to. By the explanations we have just given of freedom, necessity, and character, we have somewhat facilitated and prepared the way for the clearer development of all this, which is the principal subject of this last book. But we shall have done so still more when we have turned our attention to life itself, the willing or not willing of which is the great question, and have endeavored to find out generally what the will itself, which is everywhere the inmost nature of this life, will really attain by its assertion, in what way and to what extent this assertion satisfies or can satisfy the will, in short, what is generally and mainly to be regarded as its position in this its own world, which in every relation belongs to it. First of all, I wish the reader to recall the passage with which we closed the second book, a passage occasioned by the question which met us then as to the end and aim of the will. Instead of the answer to this question, it appeared clearly before us how in all the grades of its manifestation, from the lowest to the highest, the will dispenses altogether with a final goal and aim. It always strives, for striving is its sole nature, which no attained goal can put an end to. Therefore it is not susceptible of any final satisfaction, but can only be restrained by hindrances, while in itself it goes on forever. We see this in the simplest of all natural phenomena, gravity, which does not cease to strive and press towards a mathematical centre to reach what would be the annihilation both of itself and matter, and would not cease even if the whole universe were already rolled into one ball. We see it in the other simple natural phenomena. A solid tends towards fluidity, either by melting or dissolving, for only so will its chemical forces be free. Rigidity is the imprisonment in which it is held by cold. The fluid tends towards the gaseous state, into which it passes at once as soon as all pressure is removed from it. No body is without relationship, that is, without tendency, or without desire and longing, as Jakob Böhme would say. Electricity transmits its inner self-repulsion to infinity, though the mass of the earth absorbs the effect. Galvanism is certainly, so long as the pile is working, an aimless, unceasingly repeated act of repulsion and attraction. The existence of the plant is just such a restless, never satisfied striving, a ceaseless tendency through ever ascending forms, till the end, the seed, becomes a new starting point, and this repeated ad infinitum, nowhere an end, nowhere a final satisfaction, nowhere a resting place. It will also be remembered from the second book that the multitude of natural forces and organized forms everywhere strive with each other for the matter in which they desire to appear, for each of them only possesses what it has wrested from the others. And thus a constant internecine war is waged, from which for the most part arises the resistance through which that striving, which constitutes the inner nature of everything, is at all points hindered, struggles in vain, yet from its nature cannot leave off, toils on laboriously till this phenomenon dies, when others eagerly seize its place and its matter. We have long since recognized this striving, which constitutes the kernel and in itself of everything, as identical with that which in us, where it manifests itself most distinctly in the light of the fullest consciousness, is called will. Its hindrance through an obstacle which places itself between it and its temporary aim we call suffering, and on the other hand its attainment of the end, satisfaction, well-being, happiness. We may also transfer this terminology to the phenomena of the unconscious world, for though weaker in degree they are identical in nature. Then we see them involved in constant suffering and without any continuing happiness. For all effort springs from defect, from discontent with one's estate, is thus suffering so long as it is not satisfied, but no satisfaction is lasting. Rather, it is always merely the starting point of a new effort. The striving we see everywhere hindered in many ways, everywhere in conflict, and therefore always under the form of suffering. Thus, if there is no final end of striving, there is no measure and end of suffering. But what we only discover in unconscious nature by sharpened observation and with an effort, presents itself distinctly to us in the intelligent world, in the life of animals, whose constant suffering is easily proved. But without lingering over these intermediate grades, we shall turn to the life of man, in which all this appears with the greatest distinctness, illuminated by the clearest knowledge. For as the phenomenon of will becomes more complete, the suffering also becomes more and more apparent. In the plant there is as yet no sensibility, and therefore no pain. A certain very small degree of suffering is experienced by the lowest species of animal life, infusoria and radiata. Even in insects the capacity to feel and suffer is still limited. It first appears in a high degree with the complete nervous system of vertebrate animals, and always in a higher degree the more intelligence develops. Thus, in proportion as knowledge attains to distinctness, as consciousness ascends, pain also increases, and therefore reaches its highest degree in man. And then, again, the more distinctly a man knows, the more intelligent he is, the more pain he has. The man who is gifted with genius suffers most of all. In this sense, that is, with reference to the degree of knowledge in general, not mere abstract rational knowledge, I understand and use here that saying of the preacher, qui auget scientiam, auget at dolorem. That philosophical painter or painting philosopher, Tischbein, has very beautifully expressed the accurate relation between the degree of consciousness and that of suffering by exhibiting it in a visible and clear form in a drawing. The upper half of his drawing represents women whose children have been stolen, and who in different groups and attitudes express in many ways deep maternal pain, anguish, and despair. The lower half of the drawing represents sheep whose lambs have been taken away. They are arranged and grouped in precisely the same way, so that every human head, every human attitude of the upper half, has below a brute head and attitude corresponding to it. Thus we see distinctly how the pain which is possible in the dull brute consciousness is related to the violent grief, which only becomes possible through distinctness of knowledge and clearness of consciousness. We desire to consider in this way, in human existence, the inner and essential destiny of will. Every one will easily recognize that same destiny, expressed in various degrees in the life of the brutes, only more weakly, and may also convince himself to his own satisfaction from the suffering animal world, how essential to all life is suffering. End of Book 4, Section 56. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Book 4, Section 57, of The World as Will and Idea, Volume 1, by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by R.B. Haldane and J. Kemp. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Book 4, The World as Will, Second Aspect. The Assertion and Denial of the Will to Live when Self-Consciousness has been attained. Section 57. At every grade that is enlightened by knowledge, the will appears as an individual. The human individual finds himself as finite in infinite space and time, and consequently as a vanishing quantity compared with them. He is projected into them, and, on account of their unlimited nature, he has always a merely relative, never absolute when and where of his existence, for his place and duration are finite parts of what is infinite and boundless. His real existence is only in the present, whose unchecked flight into the past is a constant transition into death, a constant dying. For his past life, apart from its possible consequences for the present, and the testimony regarding the will that is expressed in it, is now entirely done with, dead, and no longer anything, and therefore it must be, as a matter of reason, indifferent to him whether the content of that past was pain or pleasure. But the present is always passing through his hands into the past, the future is quite uncertain and always short. Thus his existence, even when we consider only its formal side, is a constant hurrying of the present into the dead past, a constant dying. But if we look at it from the physical side, it is clear that as our walking is admittedly merely a constantly prevented falling, the life of our body is only a constantly prevented dying, an ever postponed death. And finally, in the same way, the activity of our mind is a constantly deferred ennui. Every breath we draw wards off the death that is constantly intruding upon us. In this way we fight with it every moment, and again at longer intervals through every meal we eat, every sleep we take, every time we warm ourselves, etc. In the end, death must conquer, for we became subject to him through birth, and he only plays for a little while with his prey before he swallows it up. We pursue our life, however, with great interest and much solicitude as long as possible, as we blow out a soap bubble as long and as large as possible, although we know perfectly well that it will burst. We saw that the inner being of unconscious nature is a constant striving without end and without rest, and this appears to us much more distinctly when we consider the nature of brutes and man. Willing and striving is its whole being, which may be very well compared to an unquenchable thirst. But the basis of all willing is need, deficiency, and thus pain. Consequently, the nature of brutes and man is subject to pain originally and through its very being. If, on the other hand, it lacks objects of desire, because it is at once deprived of them by a too easy satisfaction, a terrible void and ennui comes over it. That is, its being in existence itself becomes an unbearable burden to it. Thus its life swings like a pendulum backwards and forwards between pain and ennui. This has also had to express itself very oddly in this way. After man had transferred all pain and torments to hell, there then remained nothing over for heaven but ennui. But the constant striving which constitutes the inner nature of every manifestation of will obtains its primary and most general foundation at the higher grades of objectification, from the fact that here the will manifests itself as a living body with the iron command to nourish it. And what gives strength to this command is just that this body is nothing but the objectified will to live itself. Man, as the most complete objectification of that will, is in like measure also the most necessitous of all beings. He is through and through concrete willing and needing. He is a concretion of 1,000 necessities. With these he stands upon the earth, left to himself, uncertain about everything except his own need and misery. Consequently, the care for the maintenance of that existence under exacting demands, which are renewed every day, occupies as a rule the whole of human life. To this is directly related the second claim, that of the propagation of the species. At the same time he is threatened from all sides by the most different kinds of dangers, from which it requires constant watchfulness to escape. With cautious steps and casting anxious glances round him, he pursues his path, for 1,000 accidents and 1,000 enemies lie in wait for him. Thus he went while yet a savage, thus he goes in civilized life. There is no security for him. Qualibus in tenebris vitae, quantisque periclis, degitur hoc aevi quodcunque est. The life of the great majority is only a constant struggle for this existence itself, with the certainty of losing it at last. But what enables them to endure this wearisome battle is not so much the love of life as the fear of death, which yet stands in the background as inevitable, and may come upon them at any moment. Life itself is a sea, full of rocks and whirlpools, which man avoids with the greatest care and solicitude, although he knows that even if he succeeds in getting through with all his efforts and skill, he yet by doing so comes nearer at every step to the greatest, the total, inevitable, and irremediable shipwreck, death, nay, even steers right upon it. This is the final goal of the laborious voyage, and worse for him than all the rocks from which he has escaped. Now it is well worth observing that on the one hand the suffering and misery of life may easily increase to such an extent that death itself, in the flight from which the whole of life consists, becomes desirable, and we hasten towards it voluntarily. And again, on the other hand, that as soon as want and suffering permit rest to a man, ennui is at once so near that he necessarily requires diversion. The striving after existence is what occupies all living things, and maintains them in motion. But when existence is assured, then they know not what to do with it. Thus the second thing that sets them in motion is the effort to get free from the burden of existence, to make it cease to be felt, to kill time, that is, to escape from ennui. Accordingly we see that almost all men who are secure from want and care, now that at last they have thrown off all other burdens, become a burden to themselves, and regard as a gain every hour they succeed in getting through, and thus every diminution of the very life which till then they have employed all their powers to maintain as long as possible. Ennui is by no means an evil to be lightly esteemed. In the end it depicts on the countenance real despair. It makes beings who love each other so little as men do seek each other eagerly, and thus becomes the source of social intercourse. Moreover, even from motives of policy, public precautions are everywhere taken against it, as against other universal calamities. For this evil may drive men to the greatest excesses, just as much as its opposite extreme, famine. The people require panem et circenses. The strict penitentiary system of Philadelphia makes use of ennui alone as a means of punishment, through solitary confinement and idleness, and it is found so terrible that it has even led prisoners to commit suicide. As want is the constant scourge of the people, so ennui is that of the fashionable world. In middle-class life, ennui is represented by the Sunday, and want by the 6 weekdays. Thus between desiring and attaining, all human life flows on throughout. The wish is, in its nature, pain. The attainment soon begets satiety. The end was only apparent, possession takes away the charm. The wish, the need, presents itself under a new form. When it does not, then follows desolateness, emptiness, ennui, against which the conflict is just as painful as against want. That wish and satisfaction should follow each other neither too quickly nor too slowly reduces the suffering, which both occasion to the smallest amount, and constitutes the happiest life. For that which we might otherwise call the most beautiful part of life is purest joy, if it were only because it lifts us out of real existence and transforms us into disinterested spectators of it, that is pure knowledge, which is foreign to all willing, the pleasure of the beautiful, the true delight in art. This is granted only to a very few, because it demands rare talents, and to these few only as a passing dream. And then, even these few, on account of their higher intellectual power, are made susceptible of far greater suffering than duller minds can ever feel. and are also placed in lonely isolation by a nature which is obviously different from that of others. Thus here also accounts are squared. But to the great majority of men, purely intellectual pleasures are not accessible. They are almost incapable of the joys which lie in pure knowledge. They are entirely given up to willing. If therefore anything is to win their sympathy, to be interesting to them, it must, as is implied in the meaning of the word, in some way excite their will, even if it is only through a distant and merely problematical relation to it. The will must not be left altogether out of the question, for their existence lies far more in willing than in knowing. Action and reaction is their one element. We may find in trifles and everyday occurrences the naive expressions of this quality. Thus, for example, at any place worth seeing they may visit, they write their names in order thus to react, to affect the place since it does not affect them. Again, when they see a strange rare animal, they cannot easily confine themselves to merely observing it. They must rouse it, tease it, play with it, merely to experience action and reaction. But this need for excitement of the will manifests itself very specially in the discovery and support of card playing, which is quite peculiarly the expression of the miserable side of humanity. But whatever nature and fortune may have done, whoever a man be and whatever he may possess, the pain which is essential to life cannot be thrown off. Pelides autem eiulavit, intuitus in caelum latum. And again, Jovis quidem, filius eram Saturni, verum aerunnam habebam infinitam. The ceaseless efforts to banish suffering accomplish no more than to make it change its form. It is essentially deficiency, want, care for the maintenance of life. If we succeed, which is very difficult, in removing pain in this form, it immediately assumes 1,000 others, varying according to age and circumstances, such as lust, passionate love, jealousy, envy, hatred, anxiety, ambition, covetousness, sickness, etc., etc. If at last it can find entrance in no other form, it comes in the sad gray garments of tediousness and ennui, against which we then strive in various ways. If finally we succeed in driving this away, we shall hardly do so without letting pain enter in one of its earlier forms, and the dance begin again from the beginning. For all human life is tossed backwards and forwards between pain and ennui. Depressing as this view of life is, I will draw attention by the way to an aspect of it from which consolation may be drawn, and perhaps even a stoical indifference to one's own present ills may be attained. For our impatience at these arises for the most part from the fact that we regard them as brought about by a chain of causes which might easily be different. We do not generally grieve over ills which are directly necessary and quite universal, for example, the necessity of age and of death and many daily inconveniences. It is rather the consideration of the accidental nature of the circumstances that brought some sorrow just to us that gives it its sting. But if we have recognized that pain as such is inevitable and essential to life, and that nothing depends upon chance but its mere fashion, the form under which it presents itself, that thus our present sorrow fills a place that without it would at once be occupied by another which now is excluded by it, and that therefore fate can affect us little in what is essential, such a reflection, if it were to become a living conviction, might produce a considerable degree of stoical equanimity, and very much lessen the anxious care for our own well-being. But in fact, such a powerful control of reason over directly felt suffering seldom or never occurs. Besides, through this view of the inevitableness of pain, of the supplanting of one pain by another, and the introduction of a new pain through the passing away of that which preceded it, one might be led to the paradoxical but not absurd hypothesis that in every individual the measure of the pain essential to him was determined once for all by his nature, a measure which could neither remain empty nor be more than filled however much the form of the suffering might change. Thus his suffering and well-being would by no means be determined from without, but only through that measure, that natural disposition, which indeed might experience certain additions and diminutions from the physical condition at different times, but yet on the whole would remain the same, and would just be what is called the temperament, or, more accurately, the degree in which he might be euskolos or douskolos, as Plato expresses it in the first book of the Republic, that is, in an easy or difficult mood. This hypothesis is supported not only by the well-known experience that great suffering makes all lesser ills cease to be felt, and conversely that freedom from great suffering makes even the most trifling inconveniences torment us and put us out of humor, but experience also teaches that if a great misfortune, at the mere thought of which we shuddered, actually befalls us, as soon as we have overcome the first pain of it, our disposition remains for the most part unchanged, and conversely that after the attainment of some happiness we have long desired, we do not feel ourselves on the whole and permanently very much better off and agreeably situated than before. Only the moment at which these changes occur affects us with unusual strength, as deep sorrow or exulting joy, but both soon pass away, for they are based upon illusion, for they do not spring from the immediately present pleasure or pain, but only from the opening up of a new future which is anticipated in them. Only by borrowing from the future could pain or pleasure be heightened so abnormally, and consequently not enduringly. It would follow, from the hypothesis advanced, that a large part of the feeling of suffering and of well-being would be subjective and determined a priori, as is the case with knowing. And we may add the following remarks as evidence in favour of it. Human cheerfulness or dejection are manifestly not determined by external circumstances such as wealth and position, for we see at least as many glad faces among the poor as among the rich. Further, the motives which induce suicide are so very different, that we can assign no motive that is so great as to bring it about, even with great probability in every character, and few that would be so small that the like of them had never caused it. Now, although the degree of our serenity or sadness is not at all times the same, yet in consequence of this view, we shall not attribute it to the change of outward circumstances, but to that of the inner condition, the physical state. For when an actual, though only temporary increase of our serenity, even to the extent of joyfulness, takes place, it usually appears without any external occasion. It is true that we often see our pain arise only from some definite external relation, and are visibly oppressed and saddened by this only. Then we believe that if only this were taken away, the greatest contentment would necessarily ensue. But this is illusion. The measure of our pain and our happiness is on the whole, according to our hypothesis, subjectively determined for each point of time, and the motive for sadness is related to that, just as a blister which draws to a head all the bad humours otherwise distributed is related to the body. The pain which is at that period of time essential to our nature, and therefore cannot be shaken off, would, without the definite external cause of our suffering, be divided at 100 points, and appear in the form of 100 little annoyances and cares about things which we now entirely overlook, because our capacity for pain is already filled by that chief evil which has concentrated in a point all the suffering otherwise dispersed. This corresponds also to the observation that if a great and pressing care is lifted from our breast by its fortunate issue, another immediately takes its place, the whole material of which was already there before, yet could not come into consciousness as care, because there was no capacity left for it, and therefore this material of care remained indistinct and unobserved in a cloudy form on the farthest horizon of consciousness. But now that there is room, this prepared material at once comes forward and occupies the throne of the reigning care of the day. And if it is very much lighter in its matter than the material of the care which has vanished, it knows how to blow itself out so as apparently to equal it in size, and thus, as the chief care of the day, completely fills the throne. Excessive joy and very keen suffering always occur in the same person, for they condition each other reciprocally, and are also in common conditioned by great activity of the mind. Both are produced, as we have just seen, not by what is really present, but by the anticipation of the future. But since pain is essential to life, and its degree is also determined by the nature of the subject, sudden changes, because they are always external, cannot really alter its degree. Thus an error and delusion always lies at the foundation of immoderate joy or grief, and consequently both these excessive strainings of the mind can be avoided by knowledge. Every immoderate joy, exultatio, insolens, laetitia, always rests on the delusion that one has found in life what can never be found there, lasting satisfaction of the harassing desires and cares, which are constantly breeding new ones. From every particular delusion of this kind one must inevitably be brought back later, and then, when it vanishes, must pay for it with pain as bitter as the joy its entrance caused was keen. So far, then, it is precisely like a height from which one can come down only by a fall. Therefore one ought to avoid them, and every sudden excessive grief is just a fall from some such height, the vanishing of such a delusion, and so conditioned by it. Consequently we might avoid them both if we had sufficient control over ourselves to survey things always with perfect clearness as a whole and in their connection, and steadfastly to guard against really lending them the colours which we wish they had. The principal effort of the Stoical ethics was to free the mind from all such delusion and its consequences, and to give it instead an equanimity that could not be disturbed. It is this insight that inspires Horace in the well-known ode, Aequam memento rebus in arduis, servare mentem non secus in bonis, ab insolenti temperatam laetitia. For the most part, however, we close our minds against the knowledge, which may be compared to a bitter medicine, that suffering is essential to life, and therefore does not flow in upon us from without, but that every one carries about with him its perennial source in his own heart. We rather seek constantly for an external particular cause, as it were, a pretext for the pain which never leaves us, just as the free man makes himself an idol in order to have a master. For we unweariedly strive from wish to wish, and although every satisfaction, however much it promised, when attained fails to satisfy us, but for the most part comes presently to be an error of which we are ashamed, yet we do not see that we draw water with the sieve of the Danaides, but ever hasten to new desires. Sed dum abest quod avemus, id exsuperare videtur caetera post aliud, cum contigit illud avemus, et sitis aequa tenet vitae semper hiantes. Thus it either goes on for ever, or, what is more rare and presupposes a certain strength of character, till we reach a wish which is not satisfied and yet cannot be given up. In that case we have, as it were, found what we sought, something that we can always blame, instead of our own nature as the source of our suffering. And thus, although we are now at variance with our fate, we are reconciled to our existence. For the knowledge is again put far from us that suffering is essential to this existence itself, and true satisfaction impossible. The result of this form of development is a somewhat melancholy disposition, the constant endurance of a single great pain, and the contempt for all lesser sorrows or joys that proceeds from it. Consequently, an already nobler phenomenon than that constantly seizing upon ever new forms of illusion, which is much more common. End of Book 4, Section 57, recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Book 4, Section 58, of The World as Will and Idea, Volume 1, by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by R.B. Haldane and J. Kemp. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Book 4, The World as Will, Second Aspect. The Assertion and Denial of the Will to Live, when Self-Consciousness has been attained. Section 58. All satisfaction, or what is commonly called happiness, is always really and essentially only negative and never positive. It is not an original gratification coming to us of itself, but must always be the satisfaction of a wish. The wish, that is, some want, is the condition which precedes every pleasure. But with the satisfaction, the wish and therefore the pleasure cease. Thus the satisfaction or the pleasing can never be more than the deliverance from a pain, from a want, for such is not only every actual open sorrow, but every desire, the importunity of which disturbs our peace, and indeed the deadening ennui also that makes life a burden to us. It is, however, so hard to attain or achieve anything. Difficulties and troubles without end are opposed to every purpose, and at every step hindrances accumulate. But when finally everything is overcome and attained, nothing can ever be gained but deliverance from some sorrow or desire, so that we find ourselves just in the same position as we occupied before this sorrow or desire appeared. All that is even directly given us is merely the want, that is, the pain. The satisfaction and the pleasure we can only know indirectly through the remembrance of the preceding suffering and want, which ceases with its appearance. Hence it arises that we are not properly conscious of the blessings and advantages we actually possess, nor do we prize them, but think of them merely as a matter of course, for they gratify us only negatively by restraining suffering. Only when we have lost them do we become sensible of their value. For the want, the privation, the sorrow is the positive communicating itself directly to us. Thus also we are pleased by the remembrance of past need, sickness, want, and such like, because this is the only means of enjoying the present blessings. And further, it cannot be denied that in this respect, and from this standpoint of egoism, which is the form of the will to live, the sight or the description of the sufferings of others affords us satisfaction and pleasure, in precisely the same way Lucretius beautifully and frankly expresses it in the beginning of the second book. Suave mari magno, turbantibus, aequora ventis, aetera magnum alterius spectare laborem, non quia vexari quemquam est iucunda voluptas, sed quibus ipse malis careas, quia cernere suave est. Yet we shall see farther on that this kind of pleasure, through knowledge of our own well-being obtained in this way, lies very near the source of real positive wickedness. That all happiness is only of a negative, not a positive nature, that just on this account it cannot be lasting satisfaction and gratification, but merely delivers us from some pain or want which must be followed either by a new pain or by languor, empty longing, and ennui. This finds support in art, that true mirror of the world and life, and especially in poetry. Every epic and dramatic poem can only represent a struggle, an effort, and fight for happiness, never enduring and complete happiness itself. It conducts its heroes through 1,000 difficulties and dangers to the goal. As soon as this is reached, it hastens to let the curtain fall, for now there would remain nothing for it to do but to show that the glittering goal in which the hero expected to find happiness had only disappointed him, and that after its attainment he was no better off than before. Because a genuine enduring happiness is not possible, it cannot be the subject of art. Certainly the aim of the idyll is the description of such a happiness, but one also sees that the idyll as such cannot continue. The poet always finds that it either becomes epical in his hands, and in this case it is a very insignificant epic, made up of trifling sorrows, trifling delights, and trifling efforts. This is the commonest case. Or else it becomes a merely descriptive poem, describing the beauty of nature, that is, pure knowing free from will, which certainly, as a matter of fact, is the only pure happiness, which neither preceded by suffering or want, nor necessarily followed by repentance, sorrow, emptiness, or satiety. But this happiness cannot fill the whole life, but is only possible at moments. What we see in poetry we find again in music, in the melodies of which we have recognized the universal expression of the inmost history of the self-conscious will, the most secret life, longing, suffering, and delight, the ebb and flow of the human heart. Melody is always a deviation from the keynote through 1,000 capricious wanderings, even to the most painful discord, and then a final return to the keynote which expresses the satisfaction and appeasing of the will, but with which nothing more can then be done, and the continuance of which any longer would only be a wearisome and unmeaning monotony corresponding to ennui. All that we intend to bring out clearly through these investigations, the impossibility of attaining lasting satisfaction and the negative nature of all happiness, finds its explanation in what is shown at the conclusion of the second book, that the will, of which human life, like every phenomenon, is the objectification, is a striving without aim or end. We find the stamp of this endlessness imprinted upon all the parts of its whole manifestation, from its most universal form, endless time and space, up to the most perfect of all phenomena, the life and efforts of man. We may theoretically assume 3 extremes of human life, and treat them as elements of actual human life. First, the powerful will, the strong passions, Rajshaguna. It appears in great historical characters, it is described in the epic and the drama. But it can also show itself in the little world, for the size of the objects is measured here by the degree in which they influence the will, not according to their external relations. Secondly, pure knowing, the comprehension of the ideas, conditioned by the freeing of knowledge from the service of will, the life of genius, Sattva-guna. Thirdly and lastly, the greatest lethargy of the will, and also of the knowledge attaching to it, empty longing, life-benumbing languor, Tamaguna. The life of the individual, far from becoming permanently fixed in one of these extremes, seldom touches any of them. It is for the most part only a weak and wavering approach to one or the other side, a needy desiring of trifling objects, constantly recurring, and so escaping ennui. It is really incredible how meaningless and void of significance when looked at from without, how dull and unenlightened by intellect when felt from within, is the course of the life of the majority of men. It is a weary longing and complaining, a dreamlike staggering through the 4 ages of life to death, accompanied by a series of trivial thoughts. Such men are like clockwork which is wound up and goes it knows not why, and every time a man is begotten and born, the clock of human life is wound up anew, to repeat the same old piece it has played innumerable times before, passage after passage, measure after measure, with insignificant variations. Every individual, every human being in its course of life, is but another short dream of the endless spirit of nature, of the persistent will to live, is only another fleeting form which it carelessly sketches on its infinite page, space and time, allows to remain for a time so short that it vanishes into nothing in comparison with these, and then obliterates to make new room. And yet, and here lies the serious side of life, every one of these fleeting forms, these empty fancies, must be paid for by the whole will to live, in all its activity, with many and deep sufferings, and finally with a bitter death, long feared and coming at last. This is why the sight of a corpse makes us suddenly so serious. The life of every individual, if we survey it as a whole and in general, and only lay stress upon its most significant features, is really always a tragedy, but gone through in detail, it has the character of a comedy. For For the deeds and vexations of the day, the restless irritation of the moment, the desires and fears of the week, the mishaps of every hour, are all through chance, which is ever bent upon some jest, scenes of a comedy. But the never satisfied wishes, the frustrated efforts, the hopes unmercifully crushed by fate, the unfortunate errors of the whole life, with increasing suffering and death at the end, are always a tragedy. Thus, as if fate would add derision to the misery of our existence, our life must contain all the woes of tragedy, and yet we cannot even assert the dignity of tragic characters, but in the broad detail of life must inevitably be the foolish characters of a comedy. But however much great and small trials may fill human life, they are not able to conceal its insufficiency to satisfy the spirit. They cannot hide the emptiness and superficiality of existence, nor exclude ennui, which is always ready to fill up every pause that care may allow. Hence it arises that the human mind, not content with the cares, anxieties, and occupations which the actual world lays upon it, creates for itself an imaginary world, also in the form of 1,000 different superstitions, then finds all manner of employment with this, and wastes time and strength upon it, as soon as the real world is willing to grant it the rest which it is quite incapable of enjoying. This is accordingly most markedly the case with nations for which life is made easy by the congenial nature of the climate and the soil, most of all with the Hindus, then with the Greeks, the Romans, and later with the Italians, the Spaniards, etc. Demons, gods, and saints man creates in his own image, and to them he must then unceasingly bring offerings, prayers, temple decorations, vows and their fulfillment, pilgrimages, salutations, ornaments for their images, etc. Their service mingles everywhere with the real, and indeed obscures it. Every event of life is regarded as the work of these beings. The intercourse with them occupies half the time of life, constantly sustains hope, and by the charm of illusion often becomes more interesting than intercourse with real beings. It is the expression and symptom of the actual need of mankind, partly for help and support, partly for occupation and diversion. And if it often works in direct opposition to the first need, because when accidents and dangers arise, valuable time and strength, instead of being directed to warding them off, are uselessly wasted on prayers and offerings, it serves the second end all the better by this imaginary converse with a visionary spirit world. And this is the by no means contemptible gain of all superstitions. End of Book 4, Section 58. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Book 4 of The World as Will and Idea, Volume 1, by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by R.B. Haldane and J. Kemp. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Book 4. The World as Will, Second Aspect. The Assertion and Denial of the Will to Live when Self-Consciousness has been attained. Section 59. If we have so far convinced ourselves a priori, by the most general consideration, by investigation of the primary and elemental features of human life, that in its whole plan it is capable of no true blessedness, but is in its very nature suffering in various forms, and throughout a state of misery, we might now awaken this conviction much more vividly within us, if, proceeding more a posteriori, we were to turn to more definite instances, call up pictures to the fancy, and illustrate by examples the unspeakable misery which experience and history present, wherever one may look and in whatever direction one may seek. But the chapter would have no end, and would carry us far from the standpoint of the universal, which is essential to philosophy. And, moreover, such a description might easily be taken for a mere declamation on human misery, such as often has been given, and as such might be charged with one-sidedness, because it started from particular facts. From such a reproach and suspicion, our perfectly cold and philosophical investigation of the inevitable suffering which is founded in the nature of life is free, for it starts from the universal and is conducted a priori. But confirmation a posteriori is everywhere easily obtained. Every one who has awakened from the first dream of youth, who has considered his own experience and that of others, who has studied himself in life, in the history of the past and of his own time, and finally in the works of the great poets, will, if his judgment is not paralyzed by some indelibly imprinted prejudice, certainly arrive at the conclusion that this human world is the kingdom of chance and error, which rule without mercy in great things and in small, and along with which folly and wickedness also wield the scourge. Hence it arises that everything better only struggles through with difficulty. What is noble and wise seldom attains to expression, becomes effective and claims attention, but the absurd and the perverse in the sphere of thought, the dull and tasteless in the sphere of art,
the wicked and deceitful in the sphere of action, really assert a supremacy, only disturbed by short interruptions. On the other hand, everything that is excellent is always a mere exception, one case in millions, and therefore, if it presents itself in a lasting work, this, when it has outlived the enmity of its contemporaries, exists in isolation, is preserved like a meteoric stone, sprung from an order of things different from that which prevails here. But as far as the life of the individual is concerned, every biography is the history of suffering, for every life is, as a rule, a continual series of great and small misfortunes, which each one conceals as much as possible, because he knows that others can seldom feel sympathy or compassion, but almost always satisfaction at the sight of the woes from which they are themselves for the moment exempt. But perhaps at the end of life, if a man is sincere and in full possession of his faculties, he will never wish to have it to live over again, but rather than this he will much prefer absolute annihilation. The essential content of the famous soliloquy in Hamlet is briefly this: our state is so wretched that absolute annihilation would be decidedly preferable. If suicide really offered us this, so that the alternative to be or not to be, in the full sense of the word, was placed before us, then it would be unconditionally to be chosen as a consummation devoutly to be wished. But there is something in us which tells us that this is not the case. Suicide is not the end. Death is not absolute annihilation. In like manner, what was said by the father of history has not since him been contradicted, that no man has ever lived who has not wished more than once that he had not to live the following day. According to this, the brevity of life, which is so constantly lamented, may be the best quality it possesses. If, finally, we should bring clearly to a man's sight the terrible sufferings and miseries to which his life is constantly exposed, he would be seized with horror. And if we were to conduct the confirmed optimist through the hospitals, infirmaries, and surgical operating rooms, through the prisons, torture chambers, and slave kennels, over battlefields and places of execution, if we were to open to him all the dark abodes of misery, where it hides itself from the glance of cold curiosity, and finally allow him to glance into the starving dungeon of Ugolino, he too would understand at last the nature of this best of all possible worlds. For whence did Dante take the materials for his hell, but from this our actual world? And yet he made a very proper hell of it. And when, on the other hand, he came to the task of describing heaven and its delights, he had an insurmountable difficulty before him, for our world affords no materials at all for this. Therefore there remained nothing for him to do, but instead of describing the joys of paradise, to repeat to us the instruction given him there by his ancestor, by Beatrice, and by various saints. But from this it is sufficiently clear what manner of world it is. Certainly human life, like all bad ware, is covered over with a false luster. What suffers always conceals itself. On the other hand, whatever pomp or splendor any one can get, he makes a show of openly. And the more inner contentment deserts him, the more he desires to exist as fortunate in the opinion of others. To such an extent does folly go, and the opinion of others is a chief aim of the efforts of every one, although the utter nothingness of it is expressed in the fact that in almost all languages, vanity, vanitas, originally signifies emptiness and nothingness. But under all this false show, the miseries of life can so increase, and this happens every day, that the death which hitherto has been feared above all things is eagerly seized upon. Indeed, if fate will show its whole malice, even this refuge is denied to the sufferer, and, in the hands of enraged enemies, he may remain exposed to terrible and slow tortures without remedy. In vain the sufferer then calls on his gods for help. He remains exposed to his fate without grace. But this irremediableness is only the mirror of the invincible nature of his will, of which his person is the objectivity. As little as an external power can change or suppress this will, so little can a foreign power deliver it from the miseries which proceed from the life, which is the phenomenal appearance of that will. In the principal matter, as in everything else, a man is always thrown back upon himself. In vain does he make to himself gods in order to get from them by prayers and flattery what can only be accomplished by his own willpower. The Old Testament made the world and man the work of a god. But the New Testament saw that in order to teach that holiness and salvation from the sorrows of this world can only come from the world itself, it was necessary that this God should become man. It is and remains the will of man, upon which everything depends for him. Fanatics, martyrs, saints of every faith and name, have voluntarily and gladly endured every torture, because in them the will to live had suppressed itself, and then even the slow destruction of its phenomenon was welcome to them. But I do not wish to anticipate the later exposition. For the rest, I cannot here avoid the statement that to me optimism, when it is not merely the thoughtless talk of such as harbour nothing but words under their low foreheads, appears not merely as an absurd, but also as a really wicked way of thinking, as a bitter mockery of the unspeakable suffering of humanity. Let no one think that Christianity is favourable to optimism, for on the contrary, in the Gospels, world and evil are used as almost synonymous. End of Book 4, Section 59. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.